There was a small private funeral at the synagogue, followed by a very intimate service for Poppy at the cemetery where his wife and son were buried. Irene decided to stay behind at the house to watch Viva, and her daughters assured her that was fine. Leon and Jacqueline invited everyone over to lunch at their place, and even though it wouldn't be kosher and it wasn't really Shiva, it was a relief for the exhausted family. The Argentinian girlfriend wasn't there. Fred Davids, his wife, and a trio of his staff members came to the memorial service, and that was all. Graveside, with everyone else departed, 3 women stood alone together with the rabbi. Lena mumbled a prayer as her grandfather's casket was lowered into the plot he shared with his beloved Beatrice. Eva and Carmen held hands with one another. They thanked the rabbi and the staff who assisted. They did not wait for the grave to be filled. No one from law enforcement was parked nearby, waiting or watching. Lunch was quiet but pleasant, with memories shared. Tyrell brought out his old Legos for Viva to play with. Jacqueline made fried chicken and potato salad for everyone. While Leon had Lena's attention that afternoon, he pulled her aside to speak about Carmen. Jacqueline assured her husband that she would keep his auntie distracted. We're looking at rest homes. I think it's time she stopped doing for others and enjoy her twilight years. Lena agreed and promised Leon she would stay at the condo while he made those arrangements. The following Sunday, she rose from the couch where she had been sleeping and stepped outside to pick up the Detroit Free Press. There, on the lower half of the front page, was a picture of her grandfather. It was taken during the late 50s, it appeared. She glanced around to her left and to her right, self-consciously checking to see if anyone in the neighborhood was watching. Lena sat down there on the front porch in her spring robe and began to read. This Tuesday, a quiet service took place in memoriam of Michael Ashner. This reporter was not present at that service, but I once met the man that was being eulogized. I guess you could say that I did him a favor a long time ago. I was a stringer on the AP in '66 when I met Ashner covering a story. A decade later, his name was raised in conjunction with missing Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa. My old man had been a groundskeeper at the Hazel Park racing track, and I knew several people suspected in Hoffa's disappearance. One of those being raised as a suspect back in '75 and '76 was Michael Ashner. Now, I have no doubt that Michael Ashner, Poppy as he was known most of his adult life, probably had nothing to do with the presumed murder of James P. Hoffa, head of the Teamsters Union. According to sources, Poppy was allegedly out of the business at this point, but I only knew it because an old contact of mine, a lawyer who represented my father once on a drunk driving charge, swore it wasn't so, and I believed him. David Gerwich would go on to become a state attorney and ran unsuccessfully for a state senate position before joining the parole board. He later accepted a judgeship in Wayne County, a position he served in until his death at 70, when he fell asleep at the wheel after a long day pheasant hunting in Ypsilanti. Gerwich was garrulous, to say the least, more so when he was in his cups. He was always worth listening to. One night, in the fall of 1975, I got the opportunity to bend his ear. It had been a long, confounding day at my office. Not because of Hoffa, although he'd been ever present on my mind for 4 months, since his July 30th disappearance. No, this was the day after the Edmund Fitzgerald wrecked in Lake Superior. The great storm had charged in from the Rockies, hit Lake Superior early on the night of November 10th, and swept down over the Mitt, giving Detroit a good soaking all day. The Iron Horse got caught in a hellacious storm and foundered. I was up until 4 a.m. chasing leads from NOAA and NASA, then at Mariner Church in the morning to watch Reverend Ingalls toll the bell 29 times. I was exhausted and as bedraggled as a wharf rat by close of business that night. I felt beat up from the day and from the weeks prior, chasing my tail looking for leads into Hoffa's whereabouts. That night, The 11th, I stopped off at the bar near my pop's place for a beer. Gurwitch was at the end of the brass-railed bar, and when he saw me, he raised his glass, a golden nectar of some sort, and patted the stool beside him. I was always pleased to see Gurwitch, who bemoaned my choice of careers simply because he felt I'd always be poor. On that he was mostly right. But that night in particular, it felt fortuitous to run into the friendly attorney and get his take on my Hoffa theories. Gurwitch was no stranger to the left side of the law. He had represented a coterie of broken-nosed thugs and oily money men, along with their many underlings such as my pop, in his days as a defense attorney during the 40s and 50s. He was good and he was expensive, and those guys needed representation and wasn't afraid to work with them. That's how he wound up helping out my old man back in 1957, a referral from the Hazel Park guys. I ordered a Michelob and loosened my tie. We clinked glasses for the Fitzgerald, but I didn't have to tell Gurwitch what was really on my mind. He smirked at me. Who's your culprit of choice, my boy? I rattled off the names of a half-dozen slippery candidates, bandied about around the newsroom. Mostly, I wanted to watch his reaction. I included Michael Ashner in my list, whom I met once a few summers before. It wasn't out of any real suspicion on my part. I was merely repeating what I'd heard from the other stringers on the beat. But I knew that Gurwitch knew the man, and I wondered, was Ashner on his list of suspects? Gurwitch heard my litany of names, alternately cocking his head or shrugging. He didn't affirm any of my offerings, but Ashner's name was met with an emphatic no before Gurwitch paused, staring down the bar. He threw down a strong swig of his murky elixir. I lit a Winston and asked him, "Tell me why you think he didn't do it." He offered some loose rationales for a few of the other men first. One was out of state, apparently. But when he got around to Michael Ashner, he turned on his stool to face me. I know that man. Ashner was surely capable of murder at some point in his life, but he respected Jimmy. They'd both been involved in a situation, about 15 or 16 years back. A deal involving a trucking company out of Wyandotte. And their sons palled around together when they were kids, but no. I've heard some things, and that guy, well, he ain't that kind of criminal. He had loyalty, even honor. For the next 3 hours, while the drumbeat of rain rose and fell, and bowls of peanuts were intermittently refilled, Gurwitch told me an unforgettable tale. In 1937, Michael Ashner was 26 years old and managing some Moroccan club down in Paradise Valley, near where groundbreaking started last October on the new Tigers ball field. Rumor was, Gurwitch said, Ashner was appointed to run the place after the owner, some shaky Armenian named Guli or something, got himself in real bad with gambling debts, and the Livornos assumed ownership. Nice, I commented, and peeled back another papery peanut shell. Gurwitch, at the time, was barely out of law school. A nice-looking half-Jewish kid with big ears and huge ambitions. One day Lou, a haberdasher who lived at the Wardell building, whom Gurwitch knew from shul, came up to the attorney after court. "Come have lunch, Witchy?" Gurwitch followed his friend down the block and around the corner to a sandwich shop on Brush Street, the kind of place where nobody ever looked up from their meal, and the windows were perpetually foggy from the kitchen grill. Gurwitch and Lou walked into the diner, shuffled the street dust off their shoes, and slipped into a large corner booth where 4 men were already seated. The 4 were drinking coffee silently and contemplating the tabletop. One of them, a balding guy originally from Pittsburgh, insisted on buying pimento cheese sandwiches for the whole table. Then they started talking. Gurwitch later told me that one of those men was a prominent local department store owner. One was some kind of inventor. One was a woman's doctor, and the last one owned 3 hotels. They were talking about a man who was no decent man at all, and certainly no man of God. They were talking about Father Charles Coughlin. Over the course of the next hour, That skinny little kid with jug ears who would grow up to be David Gurwitch, Esquire, nibbled his cheese sandwich and listened carefully to the discussion around him. As lunch ended, he was handed a business card and invited to a poker game a week later at someone's house. After the game, Gurwitch was invited to a meeting, and at the meeting, he was asked to join them. "What's this called?" I asked them. They told me, "We ain't got a name, we got a game. Is you in, kid, or is you out?" And shit, I said I was in. "Don't keep me in suspense, you shyster. What was it?" They were going to take him out. Coughlin? They were going to kill him? Maybe. They were going to do something. I'd always wondered if anyone ever stood up to the demon priest of the Shrine of the Little Flower, the Jew hater with the big mouth and the 1,000,000 radio followers. Good to know someone cared all those decades later. Coughlin's reach was growing throughout the nation. That parish priest might not have been kissing cousins with the Austrian son of a bitch who was propped up as Chancellor of Deutschland 4 years before, but they were certainly cut from the same cloth. This was early 1937. It would be a year before the Anschluss of Austria, more than 2 years before the invasion of Poland, and 8 long years before our men in uniform would open the gates of hell and find the starved remnants of a once thriving European Jewish population. We Americans, as Gurwitch put it to me that evening in the pub, had no way of knowing how bad it would get. But he admitted that it didn't require a soothsayer to get a sinking feeling in their stomachs when they thought about what was happening overseas. Worse, it wasn't hard to imagine something equally foreboding happening right here in the USA. Hadn't Henry Ford raged in the Dearborn Independent about the Jews taking over? Didn't that smug Charles Lindbergh praise Nazi airmanship and proclaim that leaders of the Jewish race are not American in interests and viewpoints? Yeah, there was a fair share of Jew-hating going on right in our own damn country, but none more vitriolic than that of Father Charles Coughlin. The priest was a likely instigator if something similar was going to happen on this side of the pond. A lot of money flowed his way, and more Americans were listening intently to his radio broadcast. Sure, he shut down briefly in 1936 to try his hand at running a political organization, but he was right back up in 37, spewing his hate and bile across the airwaves. Today, when you drive by that pretty Catholic church up Birmingham, where nothing alarming ever seems to happen, it's hard to imagine a Father Coughlin. Born in Canada, ordained in Toronto, Father Coughlin came to Michigan in 1923. The priest was shuttled around several small Detroit parishes before landing the position at the Shrine of the Little Flower on Woodward and 26. He preached social justice, but those words did not mean the same as they do today. Coughlin was anti-FDR, anti-communist, anti-free market capitalism, and vehemently isolationist. Like many in Germany, he believed that the banking industry was born from the tribe of international Jewry that led to Bolshevism and had the American working class by the balls. Coughlin was especially hateful of the Federal Reserve System, his most frequent target. His radio program, launched in 1926 on WJR and picked up in 30 by CBS Radio, spread this malevolent mouthpiece across the nation. Oh, it started innocuously. A Catholic priest encouraging listeners to act from religious conviction to protest the Ku Klux Klan. Initially supportive of FDR, he was the first to say, "The New Deal is Christ's deal." And Coughlin encouraged his radio congregation to support the new president. That support ended in 1934, 2 years after the priest endorsed Roosevelt for his first term. He began to talk on air about money changers and the cash famine he claimed the U.S. was facing. His focus was on economics, a disdain for free market capitalism and property rights, but it was couched in the same anti-Semitic hate speech coming out of Berlin. Like the Nazis, Coughlin saw communism, which, along with Wall Street, he decreed the twin faces of Satanism, as a Jewish multinational coup d'etat. Starting in 1936, Coughlin began praising Hitler and Mussolini with increased fervor. His newsletter even reprinted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fake document claiming a Jewish conspiracy to rule the world through financial manipulation. Oh, there were attempts to silence Coughlin, whom some began to call the demon priest. He denied that he was anti-Semitic and disassociated himself from an American wing of the National Socialist Party. A number of prominent Catholics begged the Padre to walk back his talk. Their pleas only ratcheted up the rhetoric. Coughlin's first political endorsement, following his meetings with Joseph Kennedy Sr. and Frank Murphy, a local legal scholar, later appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1940, was of Huey Long. The Vatican stepped in, but nothing stopped the radio priest or his listeners. Coughlin's response after the November 1938 attacks across Germany, dubbed Kristallnacht, was to claim that Jewish persecution only followed after Christians first were persecuted. This finally was the beginning of the end. Stations across the country began refusing to air his program or cover his speeches. But that was almost 2 years after Gurwitch got involved. The men that Gurwitch met with in 1937 were making their own plans. They needed a lawman on their side, someone who could defend them if needed, and someone who could help ensure that a defense was never, in fact, actually needed. And so, young David Gurwitch, a year or 3 out of law school, wound up joining an unlikely cabal of Jewish professionals within the metropolitan Detroit area who were actively seeking ways to disarm the voice of the dangerous radio priest. There were fine, upstanding citizens within this group, lawyers and doctors and such. There were also a few women. And there was a man named Michael Poppy Ashner among their ranks. Yes, a criminal, a thug. At the moment, Ashner was known as a reputed enforcer for the syndicate. But he also was a Jewish man who was born in Europe and one who had certain, shall we say, means. Gurwitch whispered to me a few names from this group that he got involved with, and I recognized some of them quite well. Sadly, they're all gone now. Otherwise, I'd be interviewing them and letting them tell you all about it, instead of yours truly remembering a conversation told by a hell of a man more than 2 decades ago. Gurwitch told me that nobody judged Poppy within this group. They never looked down their schnozzes at him or pulled rank. He was neither their leader nor a follower. Ashner was simply one who would roll up his sleeves and get a dirty job done. Some of what needed to get done involved skirting around the law, including getting their hands on illegal material. Like the time they tried to dynamite the radio tower, it was Ashner they turned to for the explosives. Gurwitch talked about 2 specific attempts to hit Coughlin. First, there was an assassination attempt. They had liquid arsenic, and one of the dames took a job at a restaurant that the priest was known to frequent. She was supposed to take his glass of water away to refill it, but all they could give her was a little bottle with a couple drops worth. It was hiding in her brassiere. She went into the ladies' room to tuck it into the band of her sleeve, and the bottle plummeted down the drain. Then there was the attempted bombing of the radio station. They had the dynamite and men ready to place the TNT. What they did not have was a way into the studio. If they placed the detonators outside, they ran the risk of being caught or not hitting their target. They also knew that innocent people could be collateral damage. I could imagine these men in suspenders and caps slinking around the alleyways of WJR before agreeing it was too risky. For a while they resorted to the written word. They printed editorials and pamphlets trying to reveal the truth of the priest's broadcasts and his financial supporters. They came up against some pretty powerful men trying to distribute the material. In the end, they decided to let Coughlin blow himself up, figuratively. They diverted to more productive work and let the priest be his own undoing. Damned if Coughlin didn't do exactly that. The radio priest was off the airways by 1940, barely a footnote in our nation's history. Those men and women who tried to thwart his efforts, they not only went on to have successful lives, but they made significant differences in other ways, including focusing on what was happening in Europe. They secured false documentation and sent money abroad. Some of them even went overseas to try to save lives. One of those men wound up becoming prominent in the fledgling state of Israel a decade later. One man created an American-Israeli aid association. All had children. Most of those that Gurwitch was involved with lived well into their 80s and even their 90s. David Gurwitch also told me one more story that night about Michael Poppy Ashner. I told him first about my experience meeting Ashner. It was spring of '66. We were a little more than a year away from the Detroit riots, but tensions were high in the labor world. I was working for WWJ and showed up at a labor hearing involving a linen supply company and a local baker. It really was a nothing assignment, but I was paying my dues just out of school. I was the first or second reporter to arrive near the University of Detroit. I wasn't even sure who was involved in this case, other than the baker, until suddenly a gaggle of other reporters showed up. We were clustered around the steps of this building when Bill Bonds came lumbering up the street, making sure we all saw him arrive. He'd heard that Michael Ashner would be at this mediation hearing. Bill had been at WXYZ, our local ABC affiliate, for a little over a year, but was already making a name for himself and his big mouth. In short time, he crawled his way from a part-time position to sharing the desk for the 6 p.m. news. Bonds had been mentored by Barney Morris there at ABC and was poised to take the lead anchor spot. It couldn't come soon enough, if you asked him. Bonds was a born arguer, constantly at odds with the gray suits at WXYZ. He claimed if a busload of Catholic nuns were killed and raped on Belle Isle, they would have no reaction. Bill didn't simply report the news for more than 3 decades. He liked to dramatize it, and every once in a while, he made the news himself. Oh, a dozen or so DUI arrests over the years. That's long before he made his big Hollywood debut in Planet of the Apes, basically playing himself. Bonds saw Ashner coming down the steps and pushed his way through the small crowd of newsmen. Ashner was flanked by 2 other men. One was sentenced to life in prison and 70 for killing a cop, by the way. Bonds stuck his microphone and his mug through the crowd into Michael Ashner's face. Mr. Ashner, what kind of example are you setting for your own son by taking bribes in exchange for? And suddenly, the rather short man in the center flicked the microphone from his face with his left hand, and with his right landed a solid punch smack in the center of Bill Bonds' face. I was standing to Bill's left and saw the swing, but I did not need to look closely at the aftermath to know that Ashner just broke Bonds' nose. I heard it pop, and I saw the blood spurt. Yes, folks, that famously crooked proboscis on our friendly ABC news anchor was courtesy of Michael Ashner himself. Ashner wasn't arrested. In fact, nobody really seemed to care much, except Bill, of course, who landed on his knees upon the pavement. He was moaning in pain, holding his tie to catch the last bit of blood dribbling out. Me, I happened to be standing there with a Pepsi in a paper cup. I was waiting for something to happen before the hearing and picked up the pop at a nearby coffee shop. I'd virtually drained all the liquid out, but it was a cool day and the crushed ice was sitting at the bottom. When I saw Ashner shake his hand after the punch and watched his knuckles coloring up, I pushed the cup full of ice toward him. Give me your hanky. I stretched out my hand toward the infamous criminal, scowling on the steps in front of me. Thanks, kid, he muttered, and the lackey beside him fished a handkerchief out of his own front pocket, and together we shook a handful of ice in. Nice of you, Ashner acknowledged, and wrapped his hand up with the ice. He started to continue down the steps. He paused and smiled at me. That's when I had to go and foul it all up by asking, "Can I get a statement?" Ashner chuckled and shook his head. No. As he started to make his way past, though, he turned back and muttered, "No comment, but I'll give you a piece of advice. You got a very nice nose. Keep it that way. Remember that, newsboy." He clapped me on my shoulder and continued on his merry way. So if you ever wondered why I turned down that charity boxing match with Bob Wojnowski, there's your answer. Pure vanity. I did have a nice nose, in fact, and still do. Later that weekend, I asked my pop about Ashner. He grimaced. Oh, he's a lot bigger than most people know. He ain't at the top, but he's got a little bit of everything. And that's way better, isn't it? I agreed, but I was 20 at the time, and what did I know? So that day, when Gurwitch started to tell me his tale about the plot to take down Conklin, I already had an opinion of Michael Ashner and a confrontation with the man that was not altogether unpleasant. What Gurwitch then told me, in more hushed tones, was about the 3 tooks that Ashner took into Europe in 38 and 39. During one of those trips, he acted as a courier to get false documents into Poland. He traveled using an assumed identity. Gurwitch explained that Ashner funneled money from several organizations, individuals, and congregations to help get people to safety in Nazi-threatened territories. On his 3rd trip overseas, he returned to the U.S. with a family of 4, a woman who traveled as his wife, an older man identified as his father-in-law, and 2 very young children. None of these people were related to Michael Ashner. In fact, none ever met the man before the day they flew out of Europe with him. Gurwitch believed they settled in New Jersey, the family, and that many others made it to safety because of Ashner's actions and those who helped him. I wasn't totally convinced, despite my own slightly benevolent feelings about him. So how do you know he wasn't involved with Hoffa's disappearance? I interrogated Gurwitch good-naturedly. Because who do you think financed that trip to Poland? That silenced me. I stood leaning into the bar on that long-ago night, dumbfounded and only a little bit drunk. If true, it might not make up for the decades of crooked business dealings, embezzling, armed robberies, extortion, perhaps even murders that Michael Ashner had been involved in. But it is something to note, something of merit, along with the crimes and the corruption. In fact, what Gurwitch told me was that the good work Ashner did in bringing families out of Europe actually cost him. The organization wasn't happy with Ashner that he risked deportation, potentially exposing them and drawing attention to their operations. Plus, he used syndicate money in his efforts. When he returned to Detroit from his 3rd trip, he got called out by the Livorno family. Gurwitch muttered, "He got spanked for overstepping." The Livornos found out about his work against Conklin as well. They told him to leave the politicking to the bosses. They warned Poppy that if he continued to stick his nose in where it didn't belong, that he'd pay. So he jumped ship to work for the Zeffirellis. The Zeffirellis took him on the condition that he not take matters into his own hands again. But Vicente Livorno made sure that Poppy took the heat on an outstanding bribery charge in compensation. He spent a year or 2 in the pen. Ashner had a family after he got released, and everything on the line to protect. He turned to Hoffa, who made sure that Poppy kept a low profile. Ashner was grateful for Jimmy's help and valued the man as a friend. How do you sum up the life of a man who would never be lauded as a hero by much of society? In his illustrious life, Michael Ashner was presumed to be many things and to have perpetrated many crimes. His first arrest was in 1927 for roughing up a coin merchant on Hastings Street, a charge that was dropped when a man named Joseph Winooski assured the court that he would take responsibility for the 16-year-old boy. Ashner's 2nd arrest, 13 months later, was for possession of a stolen firearm. He sat at the Dearborn jail for 21 days and was found guilty but released with time served. There were 16 warrants served on Michael Ashner from 1930 to 1936. They ranged from charges of trafficking in stolen merchandise to armed assault, but nothing stuck to him. By that point, Poppy had become a significant force within the Livorno family organization. He lay low the next 3 years, and now we understand why. In 42, Ashner was found guilty of bribing a city sanitation administrator and remanded into custody at Jackson State Penitentiary that July. He served 11 months without incident. He had few visitors, although Ashner was a newlywed. He was released 3 months early for good behavior. But his release brought a marked change for Ashner professionally. He quietly accepted his punishment. 6 weeks later, he started his own business. Ashner Delivery Services had 12 trucks throughout the city, mostly utilized for commercial moving purposes. He sold that business 2 years later and invested with a man named Morty Blackstein, who died 3 winters later, in a commercial laundry service. Great Lakes Laundry serviced the area hotels and commercial maid services. I couldn't find documentation of Ashner's trips to Europe to verify Gurwich's story, but again, he allegedly used a forged passport for his travels. After all, he would have been prevented from returning to the States on some of those journeys with his record. Nor can I find evidence of anyone that he helped during the Nazi buildup. It's hard to know for certain how significant his efforts were, or whether any of those he helped can testify to his benevolence. Maybe it was another of Gurwich's tall tales. I also found no proof to dispute the official story that Ashner left the organization around 1969. Sure, for decades there continued to be rumors and innuendos that he wasn't as removed as he'd prefer people to believe, but I found no facts to back that up. The rumors persisted and will continue to persist, like the claim that he took his dirty money and turned it into a Ponzi scheme with the help of a wily financial advisor. Is it true? Hard to say. It's rumored that Michael Ashner was seen on Belle Isle the day the 43 riots began, that he attended the 1962 Democratic rally in Detroit at the Sheraton Cadillac Hotel, guest of Governor John Swainson, that he secretly brokered the Studebaker-Packard merger, and still, to this day, that he was involved in the disappearance of Teamsters Union leader James P. Hoffa. Gurwich was adamant that Poppy's actions would have kept him loyal to Hoffa, someone that facilitated his rescue efforts overseas. But gossip has a way of keeping itself alive, decade after decade. Truth? Well, that's more elusive. Only this I can confirm. A boy was born in Hungary, came to America with his parents, was orphaned, moved to Detroit, earned a reputation as a tough and strong-willed young man in a dangerous line of work, married, fathered a son, who fathered 2 daughters, then spent his final months of life in peril of a sentence for fraud and embezzlement which, if successful, would have landed him in federal prison at the age of 88. Michael Ashner was born, and now he has died, and it is likely that nobody living knows the full truth of who this man was. I think the glimpses that we saw of him throughout the years told us more about what we wanted to believe than what was actually true. Tom Black, April 1998, Detroit Free Press, editorial staff writer.